the first few verses. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And so we've got a context going out to, as he addresses it, the 12 tribes in the dispersion. I am persuaded right now that is discussing Jewish Christians who have been dispersed out of the Jerusalem area and are now in other places. And he is writing this letter to them. And they are obviously enduring various trials, like everyone does in life. And so he begins by addressing the need to understand these trials as being opportunities to develop and perfect your faith, and not as being hindrances the way that most of us think about them. Most of us tend to think that problems are bad and they're a setback, and they're trying to prevent us from achieving our goals. And what he is actually saying here is that if we respond to these things properly, and we develop the patience that we need to develop, that in fact they won't hinder us from attaining our goal. They'll help us attain our goal. That's where he goes. Let them have their perfect and complete result, so that you'll be lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. He gives generously to all without reproach. This statement isn't made in a vacuum. And so I think a lot of times when we read it, we pull it out of its context and we think that it is speaking about some, I'm going to use the word mystical, in terms of a mystery, unknown way in which this happens, that God will just mystically deliver wisdom to us. If we pray for God to give us wisdom, we're just going to have it. And I don't think that's the idea at all. In fact, much of wisdom comes from what? Okay, experience. And the role of experience is because experience is what gives us understanding. There is three related things, and they're clearly related as they're presented in the Scriptures, and I think they're self-evident to be related in life. There's knowledge, there's understanding, and then there's wisdom. Not everyone who has knowledge is wise. There are people who have lots of knowledge, but they're not very wise about the way they handle and use that knowledge. There are lots of people who have lots of knowledge, but they really don't have understanding, or they don't grasp the information that they possess. There's a big difference between knowing something and grasping that thing, which I think understanding is implied, that you grasp it, that you understand how it works, that you understand why it's that way, that you understand what it means and how it applies and all of those things. And wisdom takes both of those things, knowledge and understanding. It takes the knowledge, it takes the grasping and the realization of how it applies, and then it does just that. It applies it and puts it into practice. We get wisdom through experience. And this is a context that's talking about counting it all joy as we incur trials of various kind, knowing that the testing of our faith produces steadfastness, and that steadfastness will have its full effect, that I'll be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And so when I ask of God to give me wisdom, I might very well be asking of God to provide for me the opportunity to grow and develop my faith so that I am perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I have a fully developed understanding and knowledge about how to apply the things of God. I'm going to get that, according to the first few verses of this chapter, through the testing of my faith. So, God gives generously to all without reproach, but that does not mean that it's not difficult or there isn't work involved. And that doesn't mean that it's to be understood outside of this context, which is that we develop that understanding and wisdom through the endurance of trials. Because notice what he goes on to say. Let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that's driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he'll receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Let him ask in faith without doubting. So I want wisdom, and what I get is trials, difficulties, and testing. How do I need to approach those trials, difficulties, and testing? This is the way that God is bringing me wisdom. But if I ask and I doubt that, how do I respond to trials and difficulties? And you ever heard anybody express, "Why me, Lord? Why have you let this happen to me?" See, that's someone who doesn't trust God. That's someone who assumes that if something has happened, that either God isn't doing anything to protect us and stop it from happening, or that God is doing something unjust in making this thing happen. We're going to develop that idea a little bit more next hour. But the fact of the matter is, it may be God doing the very thing that we need and allowing to happen the very things that we need. And so when I ask for these things, when I ask for wisdom and various trials come into my life, I need to ask, having confidence in God, that God is allowing these things to take place so that I can do what? So that I can be fully developed, that the full effect of these things may be that I come to not just have knowledge about what God would have man do, but also understand and have the ability to make application of that in life, or apply wisdom in my judgment. We normally associate the word wisdom with judgments, right? With apprising things properly, with understanding the situation and offering a judgment about the right way or the right path forward. Part of that comes through this process that he's talking about, this process of the testing of our faith. Is life intended to be easy for the Christian? That's the question we got to ask. And the answer is no. There has never been a promise from God that life will be easy for the Christian. There has been a promise from God that we will have a very present help, that we will be aided. There's a promise from God that we can persevere if we don't lose heart. There's a promise from God that nothing's going to happen beyond what we're able to endure. So there's promises from God about limitations, about what will happen. And that the things that happen to us are going to be things that are common to man. You also get this concept, and sometimes it's very overt and sometimes it's very subtle, where people tend to think that the things that happen to them are more severe than the things that happen to anybody else. That, well, I understand your situation, I understand it was hard, but mine's even worse. And if you don't understand how mine's worse than yours, it's because you don't really understand what I'm going through. And we tend to do that. We tend to do that all the time. We tend to think that the present distress, especially that we're in, is somehow the worst situation of this that has ever happened. And what God has promised us is that nothing's going to happen to us except those things that are what? That are common to mankind. That what happens to me is the same kinds of things that happen to other people. And so I need to understand, as I come into these situations and I face the trials of life and I go through these things, that God has placed limitations on what happens, that I can endure, that I can overcome, and that in doing so I can benefit from them. And that is in fact God answering and providing the very things that I'm asking for. It doesn't mean that He's not providing what I'm asking for. It means that, now, there's going to be some more talk about prayer later in this book. There's going to be some more discussion about these things. And one of the things we're going to learn is if we ask and we don't receive, very often it's because we ask what? Amiss. Right. We ask for the wrong motives, out of the wrong motives, or we ask in things that are not according to God's will. But what I know for a certain fact is that God's will is that I finish my course in faith and that I'm saved. I know that's His will. And so He's not going to do anything or allow anything through His providence to happen, but that I can achieve that end, especially if that's what I'm praying about. If I'm praying that I might finish my course and be found faithful, I need to trust and have faith that the things that are happening in life are going to allow me to finish my course and be faithful. I don't need to ask doubting God, doubting God's motives. And again, we're going to develop this a little bit more in the next hour, but I'll go ahead and bring it up here. There's this common idea that if something bad has happened to someone, that they must have done something wrong, and that this is some kind of punishment. And part of what James is saying in this opening of this book is the testing of your faith is not some kind of punishment. The testing of your faith is allowed for your own good. And so we need to go into these problems understanding that and looking for the ways in which we can be bettered by them rather than focusing on the ways in which they're difficult. How can this make me better? How can I learn from this? How can I grow? What do I take away from this that's going to make me exercise wisdom in the future? Maybe the situation I'm in because of a poor choice that I made at some point. When I come through it on the other side, maybe I have the wisdom now to not make that poor choice going forward in the future. But only if I'm looking for it. And only if I'm carrying this attitude of looking at the trials of life as a blessing rather than a curse. And I think that's what he means in the opening words of verse 2, count it all joy when you incur various trials. He's not telling us to celebrate and be happy about difficulties. He's telling us to apprise them properly and realize that they are for our good, not to harm us. God didn't create the world the way that He created it and set up the parameters of it the way that He set up the parameters of it so that we would fail. He created it and set up the parameters that He set up so we could succeed. And so that's how we need to face these things. And we need to trust that when we ask God for something, that He hears us, and that what we are receiving is in fact those things which help accomplish the purposes of God. Which, by the way, is what we're supposed to be asking for, right? That His will be done. And so we have to keep that in mind. If we're one of those people who doubts or questions, is this helping to accomplish the completion of my faith and my wisdom in spiritual things? I don't know about that. He says we're like a person we're like a wave that's driven and tossed by the wind. It just goes around in any direction. Jude actually uses that same language to talk about double-minded men. And so we can't be unstable that way. We can't be double-minded. We have to move forward in complete confidence and trust of God. Did God fail Abraham? No. Did God fail Joseph? No. Did God fail Daniel? No. Did He fail David? Did He fail the prophets? And you keep going through and no. Did bad things happen to those people? Did difficult things come their way? Was it hard for them to live and be righteous in all that they do? Yeah. But He never failed them. Do I trust God enough to realize that He is not failing me? And so if this thing has been allowed to take place, it's been allowed to take place because in some way I can grow from it. And by the way, I would suggest to you that even the worst of things that can happen, things that on the surface have no good in them, I can still grow. I can still become a better person as a result of it, if I face it right. If someone is just evil to me, they're just evil in their treatment of me, what have I learned from that? Is there anything that I can learn from that? In terms of the context that we're talking about here, about being a better servant of God, about being wise in the way that I live my life and finishing the course and becoming complete and lacking in nothing spiritually, what can I learn from someone's evil treatment directed toward me? Well, think about it like this. Jesus has told us point blank that we should do unto others as you would have them to do unto you, right? So in other words, I need to treat you the way that I would hope that you would treat me. If someone has been just awful to me, what I have learned is how not to treat other people. I can come through that experience with my faith intact, still trusting God, and be better off for it, even though there's nothing good in the act itself, be better off for it because I now know, okay, look, that is not how I like to be treated, so that's one way that I shouldn't act toward other people. I shouldn't say those kinds of things. I shouldn't do those kinds of things because that was hurtful and harmful. And so I've just learned one way not to be. Is that a hard way to learn a lesson? Sure. But can I still count it as joy that I've learned and I've become a better person as a result of what I've experienced? And the answer is, if my goal is to be as Christ-like as possible, then yes. I can count it as joy that I've experienced something that has led me to be a better person than I was before I experienced it. And that's what he's talking about here, as I understand it. I got a comment here that suggested we learn by turning the other cheek. We certainly learn by turning the other cheek, but that's a tough lesson as well. It's a very difficult lesson to learn not to respond in kind. Someone else suggested that God always answers prayers. It's either yes, no, or wait. Well, there's some truth in that. And the waiting part of it is encapsulated in this idea of patience. And any time that we have to wait, there's a purpose. There's a value. Because again, God desires our success. He desires us to be complete, lacking in nothing. And so, if I'm praying and communicating with Him and expressing my concerns and my needs and my wants, and these things are happening, I have to be confident. Since I'm confident that God is there, and I'm confident that God is able, and I'm confident that God is listening, and I'm confident that God is giving, I have to be confident that there's some way for me to experience this and learn from it and be successful and gain the knowledge, the understanding, and the wisdom that I need to live a successful life in Christ. That kind of stability is important. And so he says in verse 9, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. Now this is introducing another big theme of this book. Now, we want to talk about several things at this point that are kind of outside the text, but that are basic information that we ought to all know. One of the things that Jesus said while he was on the earth is that we will always have what with us? Situation is, one of the disciples of Jesus spent a large amount of money on something, and there were some people complaining about that money being spent, and he said, we'll always have the poor. I will not always be here. We'll always have the poor among us. There is always going to be a disparity between the rich and the poor. There are always going to be people who have more and people who have less. Always. Now, that gap can be larger or smaller, but it's always going to exist. There's nothing that can be done about that. Next, when you have those kinds of differences, what will you also always have? Conflict. Always. Frustrations. People who don't have will always wish that they had. And people who have will not always use that the way that God would have them use it. Sometimes they'll use it to their own advantage instead of to the advantage of others. Now, the principle of the Scriptures is for us to use what we have to do what? Work with your own hands so that you have to support yourself, and you have to do what? Give to those who have need. And so the idea being is that those who have, especially those who have an excess, have a means in which they can serve and help other people. But they don't always do that, do they? Sometimes they use their advantage to do what? Make their advantage greater and serve themselves. And they're selfish in that. And so you'll always have, as long as there's these differences, some people who are envious of those who have, and some people who are abusive from what they have. That becomes another theme in this book. Because we're talking about people who are dispersed abroad. We're talking about people who are living with other ethnicities in other places than where they would, I guess, prefer to be home. And what happens when people are displaced and alone and don't have family structure and don't, well, they tend to suffer more, right? They tend to not have as much as those people. So this situation is always going to exist. It's always going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem everywhere in every area of life, and it is going to, in and of itself, create some of the difficulties, the trials of various kinds that we face. When I am in want, when I have a lack of something, how am I going to respond to that? Is it difficult to respond to that in a way that's godly? And the answer is yeah, because some folks think that because they're in a situation of want, that justifies them doing things that are not proper. That justifies them mistreating other people to try to get what they want. And by the way, want simply means lack. I think sometimes we misuse that word. We're really saying we just desire something. When you want for something, you actually lack it. You need it and you lack it. Sometimes we have an abundance, and is that a difficult time to be godly? It can be extremely difficult. In fact, Jesus taught what? It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. Now, you can debate about exactly what he meant by that phrase all you want to, but the general principle is very clear. It's difficult for a rich man to enter heaven. So yes, you can have an abundance and it can be an impediment to your faith. Can you have an abundance, however, and use it in a godly way? Yes. So this is part of the trials of life and part of the source of these trials. And it's a big part of this book. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation. So the lowly brother is lifted by God, and the rich is humbled by God. And that's how we ought to be said. And what Paul said about it is, I've learned in whatever circumstances I'm in to be content. I've learned when I'm in want to be content with what I have, and I've learned when I have access to be content. There's a process. There's something that we need to learn in this. We need to learn how to be good poor, and we need to learn how to be good rich. We can be good in both of those situations. We need to learn how to do it. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. The lowly brother should recognize and boast in his exaltation, not boast in a bad way. And the rich in his humiliation, we should understand how to be humble and use what we have in God's service. Because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. By the way, that applies to both of us. Both the rich and the poor will pass away. And so the poor needs to understand and boast in God's lifting him up, because he's going to pass away eventually. And the rich need to understand and boast or be satisfied in his humiliation, because he's going to die one day. So he needs to do this. He needs to handle this correctly, because what happens when we pass away? It's appointed unto man to die once, and after this, the judgment. So I need to understand, like the flower of a grass, I'm going to pass away. The sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, and its flower falls and the beauty perishes. So will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. I don't care how wealthy you are and how much of this world's goods you have. You know what's going to happen to you one day? You're going to die. So we had better learn how to handle that. And by the way, I think the implication throughout the Bible is that it's much harder to remain humble and a servant of God in a wealthy state than just about any other condition for man. When we have wealth and power, what do we tend to do? We tend to get arrogant, self-satisfied, and we believe we're self-sufficient. And that's a very dangerous thing. The sun rises with its scorching heat, and it withers you just the same. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Here's the important thing. When you get to verse 12, it becomes very evident that the context hasn't changed. He is still talking about remaining steadfast under trial. And so the interlude about asking for wisdom and about the rich and the poor are not about something other than being steadfast under trial. It starts with, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And it ends with, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So what we have to do is we have to learn how to face whatever difficulties life send our way, in whatever set of circumstances we're in, whether we're in want or whether we have an abundance, or as it's put here, whether we're rich or whether we're poor. We have our own set of problems, our own set of circumstances, the same, or not the same, maybe different types of trials, but all of us have trials. And I think sometimes the poor get kind of foolish and we think that rich people don't have any trials. Life is easy for them. They're not tested. They don't have to go through what I have to go through. It's not true. Everybody faces trials of various kinds throughout their life. Those things can either serve us and make us more faithful, or they can derail us. And we have to be aware and open to those things and respond to them properly. Count it joy as we incur it. Face it, look at it for what it is, and then ask yourself, how can I use this to become a better Christian? Or I'll say it another way, how can I use this to become more godly? Instead of it being the impetus for me mistreating someone, think Cain, or even Lamech, who carried that to the next level. Can you grab that, please? If a young man strikes me, I'm going to kill him. Instead of using difficulties to push you toward acting evil, you find these difficulties, and you find in these difficulties the thing that can make you good. And that's going to make you successful. That's what perseverance consists of in this context. The endurance of a trial consists of receiving it in the spirit for which God allows it to take place and learning from it so you become better, rather than rejecting it, fighting against it, and becoming bitter as a result. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. I don't believe that we'll have enough time to talk about all that section, but we have time to get into it. Does God make bad things happen to us, or does God try to get us to stumble in our walk? No. There's a difference between God setting parameters and allowing things to happen, and God making things happen. God, with Adam and Eve in the garden, set a lot of parameters that included the ability of the serpent of old to communicate and tempt them. Could that have been a good thing for Adam and Eve? Yes. The testing of your faith can produce endurance. They didn't do so good with that first test. At least not with their initial decision. I'm hoping that they learned from it. The Bible isn't perfectly clear about that, but it certainly insinuates that they did. Was God the one trying to get Eve to sin? No. God allowed the parameters to exist with which she could be tempted to sin, but what actually drew her away into sin? Her own desires, her own lusts. So, listen, we can't blame God when we do things wrong. Look, if God hadn't let this happen to me, then I never would have done that. No, that's not the way it works. Because God let something happen to me doesn't mean that I couldn't have made a good choice and done the right thing. When I did the wrong thing, it was because it was what I wanted to do. Not because of what happened to me. When I made the wrong decision, I make that wrong decision not because somebody said something to me. Okay, let's envision a world in which I get into a discussion with Greg after services one day, and I get mad and punch him in the nose. And then they come to me and say, well, why did you punch him in the nose? And I'll say, because he said this. No. Why did I punch him in the nose? Because I wanted to. Because I got mad and I gave in to my desire to enact revenge. That's why I did it. He could say the same thing to me, and what could I do? Turn the other cheek. And grow and manifest the wisdom of God. When I give in to those desires, that's because it's what I want to do, not because of the test. And we have to understand that. What he's ultimately doing is letting us know we can't blame. Just because God allows this testing to take place doesn't mean it's God's fault that we fail. When we fail, it's because we're doing what we want to do. It's my fault. I got to stop. I think that was the second bell. Maybe it was the first, but if the clock is right, which it's 9:47, it's not quite right. It's just a little bit behind. Actually, I'm past time to stop, so